Welcome to the nightclub, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. First and foremost, we have officially reached 1,000 subscribers, and I am super excited to announce that we will be doing a giveaway. Details at the end of this video. A very common question that I seem to see over and over again on the carburetor Facebook pages that I belong to, that would be the Carb LS Swaps Facebook page, that would be the Holley Carburetor Facebook page, and then there's a general carburetor Facebook page that I belong to. On all three, people seem to ask the same question: what carburetor works best on what application? And the answers that we get from all the people that are in the groups tend to be pretty varied. We've got some that are in the camp that, oh, a 570 will be too much for a carburetor, but it'll run your engine pretty good. And then we've got the people on the other side of the camp who are like, you should put a 750 vacuum secondary. Some people tend to say that nothing works better than an 850 on their particular combination. And all of these statements are usually made without a lot of fact or proof or dyno sheets to back it up, and these claims just end up falling pretty flat. I can't answer what carburetor will work on specific applications, but what I can do is actually answer the question of what carburetor works best on the stock or very mild modified carbureted LS engine. For those of you that are longtime viewers of the channel, you guys pretty much know my setup. It is a stock bottom end carbureted 5.3 liter that I picked up at the junkyard. I've got shorty headers that aren't any better than the stock manifolds. In fact, people have dynoed them back to back, and the shorty headers make about the same, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, but you know, you're splitting hairs at 1 or 2 horsepower. On top, I've got the dual plane Holley mid-rise intake manifold. I've got a phenolic 1-inch spacer. I've got a Holley 650 carburetor. Everything's managed by the Holley 6014 for the coils. And then I've got an electric fuel pump running 6.5 psi of fuel pressure, but everything else is the same. I still have the mechanical fans, I still have the truck water pump, and for the most part it's a pretty stock application, stock 706 heads. And I'm not going to be winning any street races with this combination, but it seems to work pretty good. A couple of months ago I actually went and got this engine dyno tested on a chassis dyno up in Yucaipa, California, called Big Boys Toys, and they were awesome people. We did 3 runs, and all 3 runs came out pretty much identical. Of those 3 runs, I'm going to go ahead and put my dyno sheet here. I think I've made 243 horsepower and 293 pounds of torque, which is really good considering stock baseline, no accessories. Up on an engine dyno makes roughly anywhere from like 335 to 355 horsepower, more or less. I've got a graph pulled up right here, and basically I've got 3 sets of data. The one at the very bottom would happen to be my run on the chassis dyno with my truck. A couple of things about that: this is a manual transmission truck, but it also ran with size 35 tires, 373 gears. The jetting was a little too rich. Above that, you've got the regular base horsepower run from a run that Richard Holdener actually did. Actually, a lot of these numbers I picked up, if not most of all of them, I've actually picked up from Richard Holdener's channel. Excellent information. I highly recommend you guys watch him. Go check him out. He does a lot of engine dyno combinations. So basically, above that, you've got the Brian Tooley. It's basically a stage 1 truck cam. It just increases and extends the power curve all the way up another extra 1500 2000 rpms, and then all 3 curves die off at 6500 rpms, which is the stock rev limit. These engines are notorious for valve spring float. As soon as you get above 5000 rpms, you're going to have unstable levels if you don't swap out the valve springs for something a little bit stronger. So unless you plan to modify the heads, your maximum RPM is going to be about 5500 to 6500 RPMs. Something that you guys might be able to notice is that the first 1500 to 2000 RPMs, the curves are very different from each other in terms of the engine dyno and the Brian Tooley curve versus my truck curve. And the reason for that is because my test actually started about 500 RPM sooner than the engine dynos, because chassis dynos can load up the engine a lot earlier than you can on an engine dyno. Also, the curves do go all the way out to the end, and I ended up just fitting both curves on the same chart and then cut off the ends. So try not to pay too much attention to the way the curves are formed, and try to pay more attention to the way the curves are associated to each other, because that's what's really going to make the difference. So the question is, which is the best carburetor and intake for a stock LS? If we're talking a 4.8, if we're talking a 5.3, or even a 6.0, what makes one intake better than the other one? Why can't I run a Victor Jr., a Super Victor, if I'm running a dual plane, whether that be an Edelbrock or a Holley, you know, things like that. A tunnel ram, which I don't think you guys will be running a tunnel ram on a stock application. It's way too expensive, and it's probably not even worth running, considering you could just get better performance out of a dual plane at these power levels. So a dual plane intake is probably good up to, I want to say, 600 horsepower to the crank. Obviously, engines will only absorb as much air as they need. So at full throttle, if your engine can't take up the entire single plane, it's not going to take advantage of the long runners or short runners or whatever. If the engine doesn't need the air, it's not going to suck up the air, right? It doesn't matter how big your carburetor is. If the engine doesn't need the airflow, it will not suck up the airflow. That's just the way it works. If you go in reverse, the engine is going to keep sucking through a carburetor as best as it can, regardless of how small it is. So Super Chevy, the magazine, actually brought out an article, I want to say a really long time ago, but as I was doing research for this video, it seemed to have come up, and they tested, I want to say, about 6 or 7 carburetors, starting from the NASCAR 390 up to like a 600, 650, 750, 850, 950, I want to say. And what they found was there was a Chevy 383, right? So it's a stroke 350. It made about 440 horsepower, 440 pounds of torque. And between the 390 all the way to the 950, I think the horsepower range was about 40 horsepower, 50 horsepower. I'm going to have to look up the article. I'll link it down below. But basically, when they went with the 390, the engine lost horsepower pretty much anywhere. The torque curve was really, really nice, but the engine lost horsepower everywhere. It was just a nosedive. As soon as it got any kind of RPM, the carburetor was just too small to be sucking in anything, and it was jetted square. I believe it was jetted 65. Then they stepped up to the 600 and then later the 650. What they found from the 600 and the 650 was pretty much the dyno numbers were almost identical, if save for maybe a horsepower or two. They were almost identical. They went up to the 750, and it only got about 1 horsepower better than the 650, and it started to lose power down low a little bit. They went up to the 850, and it got 1 horsepower more, but it lost a ton of power at the low RPM. They threw on the 950, and basically it didn't make any more power than the 850, but the entire power curve was just completely out of whack. Which goes to show you what carburetor sizing actually does to a performance engine. But that's a 383. What does that have to do with an LS? A 383 probably translates to about a 6.2 liter, flowing a lot of air. That thing, I believe, had aluminum heads, and it was all tricked out. It was a really good motor. 440 horsepower to the crank. It's not that much horsepower. If you guys have seen Richard Holdner's videos, you know that we can make 500 horsepower with a simple cam swap and adjusting the timing and things like that on a 6 liter. So it's really not that big a difference if you're working in a 383 and you're working a 5.3, except for one thing. 383 will pull more air than a 5.3. That's a fact. It's physically bigger. It needs more air to run the same RPM than a 5.3. I've got another chart up here, and basically I found the relationship between a dual plane manifold, a factory truck manifold, and then I've got a Super Victor intake up on here. So as you guys can see, the carburetor dual plane manifold actually beat out the truck intake below 4,000 RPMs, and it's just producing a ton of torque. After that, the truck intake takes over, and then the dual plane pretty much chases the truck intake all the way to the end, which is to be expected. The truck intake is a super well designed intake. It beats out pretty much any carburetor intake. The only thing better than the truck intake is the Trailblazer SS intake, which I didn't put on the chart because the majority of people aren't spending the extra $400 or $500 to get installed a Trailblazer SS intake, although it does tend to show significant gains everywhere, which is always a good thing. If you can increase power everywhere, you are doing pretty good for yourself. So if you guys can see that the relationship between the dual plane and the single plane, the dual plane, not only does it make more torque at the bottom end, like a ton more torque, we're talking about a 50-pound difference from peak to peak, probably even more. If you go and chase it all the way to the end of the RPM, you're going to find out that the Super Victor didn't make that much more power, and it didn't make that much more power for that much more RPM. If you were considering a drag racer, a Super Victor would probably be a good idea because you're always hovering in the upper RPMs. You need that little bit of extra oomph when you're going from gear to gear. If you have a daily driver or a cruiser or something you don't seem to, race consistently, a dual plane, it seems to be a better idea. The only time it doesn't seem to be a good idea is when the airflow demands are higher than what the intake can give. So if the intake starts becoming a restriction, then you're going to start seeing that the Super Victor can supply more airflow easier, and you're going to start gaining a lot more power on the top end. So what does that mean in English? Does that mean you can't run a Super Victor on the street? Of course you can. You can run whatever you want on the street, provided you have the correct carburetor and it's sized correctly. For a stock 5.3, I would probably recommend a 600 carburetor, and it's probably going to be jetted a little lean because the LSs provide such a great signal. It doesn't take a lot for the fuel to actually travel through the carburetor and into the throat. If you are thinking about getting a sloppy stage 2 or something similar, maybe a BTR stage 2 cam as well, a 600 will most likely still be able to supply enough air. But if you're thinking long term, I would definitely recommend a 650 because a lot of the parts from the 650s are compatible with the 670s, 750s, 780s, and 800s. If we're talking intake manifold, if you're making probably less than 600 horsepower, I would probably recommend a dual plane intake. You're going to have better street manners, you're going to have more vacuum at idle, you're going to have a smoother running operation, and you're going to get better gas mileage. So it's overall win-win-win-win. Normally when I'm looking at dyno graphs, I don't tend to look at peak numbers. You got to see the relationships of the curves to each other and see if it makes sense to add certain modifications if they don't benefit you throughout the entire curve. Like I said, if you're racing a single plane, whether it be a Super Victor or a Victor Jr., they're going to lose you a ton of torque on the bottom end, and so that's probably not something you want on a street car. If it's a race car, then you can pretty much do whatever you want. Whatever gives you the most trap speed will probably be your best bet. For everyone else that needs that torque, whether it's in a classic car or a modern car or a truck, and you want that extra amount of torque, just remember that the dual plane still produces more torque than the stock truck intake. Maybe not as good as the Trailblazer SS, but a heck of a lot more than a Victor Jr. or a Super Victor. Alright guys, so we've made it to 1,000 subscribers. Actually, as of right now, I believe I'm at about 1,009 subscribers. So thank you very much. You guys have been a great help. As I said before, I'm going to be doing a giveaway. I'm going to be custom building one of you guys a carburetor. It's going to be a Holley, either a 600 or a 650. That's usually more than enough to supply up to 500 plus horsepower. I'm more than sure that the carburetor is more than capable of supplying that much power. I'm going to have a full detailed video right after this one. I'm going to have a full video telling you guys exactly what you guys need to do to get inside this giveaway. Two things that I'll tell you now is you guys got to be a subscriber, you guys got to like this video, and then you guys got to like the next video that comes out. So good luck, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.